habits reinforce themselves. And that's why it's important to identify the habits that are not good for us and say, okay, what was it that maybe led me to a place to end up spending 6 hours on my phone, or to kind of have a day where things didn't go as well? How can I break that cycle, and how can I take the steps to build the other habits? Because it's always hard to start a new habit, but once you kind of get into that groove, more brain tissue is dedicated to that behavior, and it simply becomes easier to do it in the future. But one of the most effective ways to modify behavior is simply to observe it.
My name is Elijah Kraft. This is Kraft House Media. I'm in WASHU office right now with Dr. Tim Bono. Tim, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me to participate today.
Of course. Pleasure's all ours. He is an author. He is a professor at Washington University, St. Louis, and he's the author of the book, When Likes Aren't Enough, a crash course in the science of happiness. And I was very fascinated by this book, and I got in contact with one of my mentors who recommended that we interview you. And I was honestly very excited to see, a little bit about what your story was and really what the motivation behind this book was. So if you don't mind, just give us the whole rundown.
Sure. Well, this book in many ways draws upon the ideas that I share in a class that I teach here at WashU on the science of happiness. And that's a class I've been teaching since 2012. And you could probably trace the roots of that class back to my own undergraduate days when I was in college. I think that I was one who, like many young adults, is sort of searching for happiness and meaning and purpose. And I think that I felt like I was maybe searching in all the wrong places. And I was a psychology major, and I ended up going to graduate school in psychology. Over the course of my time in graduate school, I came to learn about this field called positive psychology, which was essentially taking a scientific approach toward understanding what are the predictors of happiness and well-being? What are some of the simple behaviors and mindsets that we can be incorporating into our own lives day to day? And the reason I got involved in that actually is because I started working in the residential life office. They hire graduate students to help with programs and resources for undergraduate students. And I saw a lot of current undergraduates at the time who reminded me of myself, kind of searching for that sense of happiness and well-being. That I was sort of in the right place at the right time and thought, well, maybe we can take our understanding of what the field of positive psychology is coming to understand about habits of wellness and happiness and incorporate that into the programming in the Office of Residential Life. So I started doing that. That informed a lot of the research that I was doing in graduate school. By the end of my graduate studies, the chair of the psychology department invited me to teach a course on the science of happiness. It started as a seminar with 17 people, and within 2 years it had more than 300. So it was evident that a lot of people had an interest in the topic. And that is common at almost every university where they offer a course on happiness. It quickly becomes popular. I think that people are interested in this. And so after teaching the class for a couple of years, students would email me or call me with stories that they had talking about how they had taken the research and put it into practice in their own lives. And there are some assignments that the students do throughout the course. And so I took all those stories together and sort of I used that information to provide a narrative around the science and the research that we cover in the class.
Wow, that's quite impressive. I'm so glad to see that this is making an entrance into the scholastic and academic environment as well. I think it's so profound, and it's part of the reason that why we're doing, our thing with Kraft House Media here. It's simply not a big enough conversation and dialogue around this, really, is what we're finding.
Yeah, and I think that that's really important to have platforms like this that are opening up dialogue around this, because I think that, the pursuit of happiness is not anything new. I think everybody has always taken an interest in it. But what is relatively new is the scientific approach that people are taking to really understand with an empirical base what are the major predictors of happiness. And so positive psychology, along with other disciplines, have taken an interest in that. And I think we're learning a lot. And it's great to have opportunities like this to talk about it and make sure that this doesn't remain in some academic journal that very few people are going to read, right, but instead have a platform where people can share it more broadly.
100%. So you have done a lot of research, in fact, on the predictors of happiness and performance in graduate students and students entering young adulthood. Mm-hmm. What are some of those insights that you've been able to find, and better yet, what are some of the personal insights that you've been able to actualize through your research?
Sure. Well, I would say that probably the single biggest contributor to an individual sense of happiness has to do with the connections that they feel with other people. So having other people in their lives who are that shoulder to lean on when things are not going well, and also the people who are there to sort of help them celebrate the good times and to sort of extend the positivity when things are going well. A lot of research has shown us that if we had only one piece of data that we could use to predict the happiness of an individual, it would be the strength of their social connections, those friends and family who are there. So building that is really, really important. If you have the option to stay an extra hour at work to advance your career, or instead to spend that hour cultivating relationships with your friends and family, yeah, every once in a while we have to stay a little extra at work, but if we can also make sure that we're balancing that with good time, to strengthen those relationships with friends and family, that is really foundational to our overall sense of well-being.
Mm-hmm. I think just from like an evolutionary perspective, I mean, we evolved in a very tribal type of environment, and our brains are still running on that hardware. So it kind of makes sense what the research is suggesting.
Absolutely, yes. That sense of social connection is something that we are hardwired. We are hardwired for that. We are social creatures, and so it's important to incorporate behaviors that allow us to cultivate that in our day-to-day lives.
Absolutely. So tell me a little bit about the book in particular. When likes aren't enough, I mean, that's pretty suggestive of, obviously the social media age that we live in right now. Everybody is very obsessed with how many likes they get on Instagram or Twitter or on a Facebook post. I mean, what was your take in creating this title, and where did you want to take that? What was your hope in what people saw in this title?
Yeah, well, I had some conversations with my editor around what would be the best take for this, because the reality is that there are a number of books related to the topic of happiness, but given that my own research has focused a lot on young adults, in particular the transition from high school into college and the predictors of happiness during college, we had an interest in tailoring the messages to that audience in particular. And so we kind of went through all of the chapters, and there were a bunch of different titles that we could have given it. Part of the reason we liked this one was because some of my earliest research was looking at the relationship of social media use and overall happiness. So I started doing this research in 2008, and that's when social media was relatively new. Facebook had been out only for a couple of years at that point. Instagram wasn't even out just yet. And so we didn't really have a whole lot of information about the impact that social media use would have on somebody's happiness levels. And if anything, we thought, well, surely it's the case that the kids who have tons of friends and they're spending all this time on this new media platform, those are the people who should be the happiest and the best off. And so we dug into the data and we found all these patterns where the kids who were spending the most time on it were actually the least happy, and they had the highest levels of anxiety and the highest levels of homesickness, and they had the most distress, and they had the most interrupted sleep patterns. And we thought, well, is there an error here? Is there a mistake? And the following year, we collected new data and made sure everything was correct, and no, same exact thing. And we began to scratch our heads and say, well, what's going on there? And it turns out that it's not social media itself that is a bad thing, because we know that social media can be a very good thing. But what we have found, and what I think is pretty common knowledge at this point, is that when social media is used as a means for social comparison, that's where it becomes really problematic. And the like button in particular seems to be the currency that people use to evaluate, is my post any good? Is my picture good? Am I getting the notoriety that I want to be getting? And if we're constantly chasing that, that means that we're constantly chasing something that's a variable that's kind of outside of our own control. And so this is to kind of call that out and say, all right, a lot of people are investing a lot of time and effort in their social media presence, which is okay to an extent, but when it gets to the point where they're dedicating their time there at the expense of other behaviors that actually could be bringing the happiness that they're seeking, that's where maybe we need to shift the conversation around a bit. So it's not to say that we should get rid of social media. It's to say, okay, well, maybe you found that you've spent an awful lot of time on that. Maybe you want to reallocate. You don't have to delete your Instagram. You don't have to get off of Facebook, but maybe you shift the proportion a little bit and spend some of the time that you were agonizing over the correct lighting for the Instagram picture and making sure that you've got everything so it looks like you're always having a good time, to say, okay, maybe you spend a little less time on that and a little bit more time meditating or exercising or spending time with actual people, cultivating authentic relationships versus just the social media relationships.
Right. I'm so glad that you actually have actionable steps in here that people can take and actualize in their own lives, as opposed to saying, well, here's the problem, but, what's the solution for it? I think it was Australia, in fact, who was doing like a beta run on Instagram on getting rid of the likes all entirely as a feature for their platform. And I was very interested when I heard that. I was wondering, what would that do to the landscape of social media? Because it seems to be so predicated on that. Yeah, the idea that we want to keep people engaged and keep people focusing on being validated, essentially. It's like a casino almost. You just keep people addicted.
Yeah, well, I'd be very interested to see what happens. I have heard about that. I don't know what the finding is. I mean, I guess time will tell. Number one, if they're able to do it, and if people will be willing to use that system. And number two, what would the impact be? Because you said something very important there, that it's like a casino. In fact, it's the exact same brain chemistry. You know, part of what makes social media addictive is the uncertainty that as you're going through, as you're scrolling through, you never know what the next post is going to be. You never know what the next picture is going to be. And if it's going to be something funny, or if it's going to be something that makes you anxious or makes you angry or makes you envious. And because of that uncertainty, that is what keeps us going back to scroll more and more. It's the same reason why people keep going back to the casino, because the next pull, you never know, is the next pull going to give you a big jackpot? You intellectually know probably not, but because there's the possibility, neuroscientists have shown that as long as there's a possibility of something occurring, that uncertainty keeps people going back more and more. And it's the same thing, that intellectually we probably know it's not a good idea for us to sit there and scroll. It's almost the same behavior. In fact, this feels a lot like this, but it's the same brain chemistry, the uncertainty. The engineers at Instagram and Facebook, they know what they're doing, and they've developed a system that's going to keep people coming back because it's in their best interest. But unfortunately, it's taking a toll on the well-being of its users. But hopefully, resources like this, conversations like this, can encourage people to put down their phone every once in a while and instead do something else that really can bring about that sense of happiness.
I was just thinking while you were talking, you said something. It's almost like it's the brain chemistry. It's just how it works. Is there any way that we can leverage that brain chemistry in a positive light, in a positive way? My mind typically just went to entrepreneurship. I mean, how popularized it is, how easy it is to start a business nowadays. I mean, outside of just social media, is there any way that we can leverage this brain chemistry in something positive? Certainly, because
part of what we know about brain science is that our brains are malleable. That means that they can change. We used to think maybe a half century ago that the brain was sort of this fixed structure, and that by the time that you reached age 20 or 25, that you had your adult brain and that it didn't change. But now we have these ideas of neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. It's the idea that the brain is plastic, that based on our intentional behaviors, we can actually kind of rewire the brain in key ways in the direction of healthier habits. And they've done all sorts of really, really clever studies. If you look at the brain of a person who has played the violin for a long time or played other instruments where they're using very specific patterns of movement with their arm or their fingers, the regions of the brain that correspond with those movements and with their fingers actually become larger over time. So more brain tissue is dedicated to those movements, and then it becomes easier to carry out those movements. That is what happens when you practice something. If you're learning vocabulary words for a foreign language, or if you're learning how to play the violin, the practice of repeating those behaviors, the reason it becomes bigger has a neurological explanation. It's because more brain tissue is dedicated to the behaviors that we choose to engage in the most. And the good news is that the same thing happens on a psychological level with the decisions that we make about the practice of gratitude, about meditation, about the social connections that we develop. The more that we engage those good behaviors, we're capitalizing on that potential for the brain chemistry to rewire itself in such a way that it just becomes more natural to carry out those behaviors. At first, maybe, if you don't keep a gratitude journal, it might feel like a more labored or more forced behavior. But the more that you do it, you find that throughout the day, your brain is just automatically going toward more positive ways of interpreting things, or something good that happens that maybe you would have walked right by or not really given it much attention, because your brain is now wired in such a way that it gives attention to those positive things. Again, it just becomes easier to do it, and so the impact of it becomes that much stronger for you.
Yeah, we surely are creatures of habit, I've noticed.
Yes, we are. And habits reinforce themselves, and that's why it's important to identify the habits that are not good for us and say, okay, what was it that maybe led me to a place to end up spending 6 hours on my phone, or to kind of have a day where things didn't go as well? How can I break that cycle, and how can I take the steps to build the other habits? Because it's always hard to start a new habit, but once you kind of get into that groove, more brain tissue is dedicated to that behavior, and it simply becomes easier to do it in the future.
I think that's such a profound insight that, even though whatever I'm trying to do, create a change in my life, it's so hard now. But if I have the know-how that when I start doing it, say 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, it's going to get easier. And it's not going to be so labored, and it's not going to be such a drag to change my behavior. I think that's a very profound insight.
Well, good. And, it's one that I think that we can all use. There's a whole body of research on behavior modification. And one of the things we know about that is that one of the most effective ways to modify behavior is simply to observe it and to pay attention, because if you have to hold yourself accountable, if you know that you're going to record the number of hours you spend each day on social media, you're thinking about, like, is it really worth it to spend another however many minutes? I'm going to have to write this down at the end of the day, how much time I spent on it. Or, if your goal is to spend more time exercising, it can be painful to have to record a 0 at the end of the day for so many days in a row. And so you keep that in mind. Holding yourself accountable can be a very effective way to change your behaviors toward, the healthier habits.
Absolutely. So tell me a little bit about these new students coming from high school, entering college. What are some of the tips that you can give them to create and design a lifestyle around success in pursuing their academic studies or creating just overall happiness in general? You hit a little bit on meditation, having a good community. Is there anything else that you can give to the students who might be watching this?
Sure. Well, I think that one of the most important things that a student can do, and really anybody of any age, but I think this is especially relevant for college students, is to manage your expectations. A lot of students have difficulties in college because somebody told them that college is going to be the best 4 years of their life, or they watch TV or the movies and they open up the college admissions brochures and they see all of the perfectly manicured pictures of everybody throwing a frisbee in the quad and everybody's happy and no one is alone unless they're underneath a beautiful tree or something and then they develop this expectation that college is going to be 4 years of uninterrupted happiness and excitement, and no one's life is like that, including during your 4 years in college. So I think that one of the most important things a student can do to prepare themselves is to have a conversation with a student who's a year or two older and say, so tell me about some of the most difficult experiences that you had, both academically and socially, just to align your expectations with the reality that everybody encounters loneliness, everybody encounters difficulty. Everybody has that class that they study really hard for and they put more hours in it than they've ever put into any class and they still get a C- or something. We've all had those experiences. And so coming into it with, number one, a realistic set of expectations that it's going to be hard at times. And number two, knowing what your resources are. So if you are struggling in a class, where do you go? If you are experiencing loneliness or homesickness, who are some people who you can talk to, who you can process that with? And if you come in with a realistic set of expectations that it's going to be challenging, then when it happens, it kind of softens the blow. You're like, oh yeah, that's right. College is hard because life is hard. And so we have to know how to forgive ourselves and say, okay, I had a bad day on this day, but now I'm going to shore that up and I'm going to see what I can do to correct the course and get back up on my feet. That mindset by itself just kind of, I think, helps people take a more realistic approach to what the experience is going to be like and to know what resources are there to help them persevere through the adversity and develop a sense of resilience to withstand other challenges that come not just during college, but in life in general.
Absolutely. Was your experience in your first couple of years of undergrad going into graduate school, how was that just the perfect smooth transition, I imagine?
Oh, completely. I'm the exception. No, absolutely not. No, and in fact, that's probably what motivated me to try to understand what are the predictors of happiness. Admittedly, I really struggled a lot, especially in my first semester. I had gone to a high school that was just very different from, a place like some others go to in terms of a college preparatory place. I was taking classes with kids who I began to wonder if the admissions office had made a mistake because it just felt like everybody else was smarter than I was and it was more academically talented. I really had a lot of difficulty my first semester of college, but I had really good mentors. I was very lucky that I had advisors who were able to sit me down and say, okay, well, yeah, you're struggling. Welcome to college. You're going to struggle. So here are some resources. Here are people who can help you with that. And so that was really a very empowering experience to have people who were able to help guide me along. And so, I think that also motivated me then to look into, well, what else is out there that we know that can help students thrive and be successful in college? And that led me to kind of dig into what behavioral scientists have discovered about the key predictors of happiness. And it's a lot of the things we've talked about here, the importance of meditation, physical activity, good night's sleep on a regular basis. That itself, probably that's one of those things we all know we should be getting. And, none of us are able to get quite as much as we want, but at least carving out the time for that and bringing awareness to the fact that on the days that we haven't slept as well, maybe we're not performing at our best. But ultimately, I became motivated to understand what the sciences had developed and come to understand about those predictors of happiness. That was what motivated me to develop a course on it and ultimately to put it all into book form.
Wow. So can we expect any more books from you in the future publications?
I kind of feel like I've emptied my head all into this one. It is coming out in paperback in January 2020. In fact, I was just working with my editor this afternoon, and they're actually kind of rebranding it. The book itself is exactly the same, but they're going to call it Happiness 101 because they're kind of emphasizing that it came from a class, so it'll have a new cover design. So it's the same exact book. You only need to get one to get the messages, but kind of been focusing on the relaunch of the paperback version coming up in January. But otherwise, I have some colleagues that we've talked about different ideas about, maybe a book for parents or looking more broadly at technology, because the technology is always changing. And so, I have a colleague who's a developmental psychologist and does a lot of research on kind of what messages parents can be giving very young children to instill in them proper mindsets to, be wise consumers of technology and interact meaningfully with others in ways that set them up for happiness and success. But all those are kind of a kernel of an idea. Well, time will tell kind of how those take shape.
See which one's popcorn.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for having us in the office today. I feel very privileged to gain your insights and have you speak in front of the camera about what your direction and where you're taking your research. And it is a very great opportunity to be here. So.
Well, it's my pleasure. Well, thanks for the time today. Enjoyed it a lot.
Sure will. You guys can buy the book, I imagine, at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, probably. Okay.
Got it, yeah.
Anywhere else that they can find?
Left Bank Books, wherever books are sold. When likes aren't enough.com.
Great. We'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.